All right, moving on to 5 ways that the foolish virgins were wise. This is perhaps the most provocative section because we like to kind of label them as two separate groups that don't really have very much overlap, right? We say that the wise were wise, the foolish were foolish, we kind of leave it at that. But we don't really think of like how the foolish were wise. And we could maybe look at some ways that the wise were foolish. Might have to look a little bit more deeply there, but certainly I think there are some ways, at least ways that kind of stand out to me, that the foolish actually displayed wisdom. And I think these deserve to be discussed and talked about. They don't overshadow the ways in which they were foolish. Like those still stand and they are significant. But I do want to play a little bit of devil's advocate here and challenge our perception or our habit of kind of painting everything in one color. Because there are ways that the 5 foolish virgins displayed wisdom, and I would like to discuss and point some of those out. One is that they took their lamps with them in the first place, right? They could have not. They could have just said, you know what, we are just going to follow the 5 wise virgins, you know, like they have their lamps. We'll just, as I said before, you know, with the potential of, okay, their lamps go out, maybe they just follow behind the 5 wise. They could have had that idea or that attitude from the beginning. They just said, oh, well, like 5 lamps is enough for all of us to like kind of, you know, illuminate the way. Like we don't all need to see where we're going. We just need to trust the people in front of us who see where we're going. Like they could have had that mindset, right? And I hope that like, as I'm saying these things, like we're thinking symbolically about what that represents in terms of our lives, in terms of our decisions, in terms of our attitude in our everyday lives, right? Because this is all supposed to be taken metaphorically. So like within the story, it could have happened that way. But also there are groups of people who are like this, right? Who don't even bring their lamps, who don't bring anything because they just say, well, everyone else has what is needed, so I'll just follow them, right? Like I'll just kind of rely on them. I'll let them do the preparation. I'll let them do the leading. I'll let them whatever, right? It's enough. They have enough. They've provided for me as well, so I'll just kind of like, you know. And these 5 foolish virgins, they didn't do that. They didn't do that. They brought their lamps with them, and I think that already shows a level of proactivity, right? That they took that initiative and that they did that. The next thing kind of adds on to this or builds onto this, and that is that their lamps weren't empty, right? So when they brought their lamps originally, they had oil in them. They had oil in their lamps to begin with. And this is another way that they were proactive, that they were wise, right? They didn't bring empty lamps with them. You know, like what good is that? They brought lamps with them, and they had enough oil in their lamps to last until the middle of the night, right? So like their lamps, like they weren't completely empty, and they didn't just have like a little bit of oil that's like about to run out, you know, like they brought, let's say, I don't know how long like a full lamp can last necessarily in those times, but I imagine them bringing full lamps, right? Like their lamps, I don't know when they started their wait in the evening time, but it says that like, if I remember the parable correctly, like the announcement goes out like around midnight, right? Saying that the bridegroom is coming and prepare ye to receive him. So like their lamps, and from what it sounds like, they let their lamps, like they left their lamps on, like running while they were there waiting and kind of sleeping a little bit, right? And so their lamps, like they lasted to the middle of the night. Like that's a significant amount of time, right? And so they brought enough for that period. They did underestimate the waiting time, right? And we'll go into that in a minute here. but they brought enough to last a significant amount of time already. And so that again shows an element of wisdom, an element of proactivity that I think deserves acknowledgement and recognition. The third way that the foolish virgins were wise is that they asked for help. And they didn't wait until their lamps had gone out to ask for that help. So they didn't stay silent and shy, waiting for the other virgins to kind of notice what was happening and reach out and be proactive and offer assistance, right? They were proactive in communicating their situation and seeking support. And they didn't wait for their lamps to go out before they asked for that help. So again, looking at the King James Version, it says, "For our lamps are gone out," but so I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. I'm using a lot more like LDS kind of perspectives. It can be applied probably more generally to a broader Christian audience. But I'm using resources that we often use within that church community. And so a footnote kind of shows us there that the Greek rendering of that phrase isn't so much translated correctly in English as like "our lamps are gone out," but it actually specifies that they are going out. Like our lamps are starting to go out, like they're about to go out. So it wasn't that they had already like fizzled out and they were dark. They were about to go out. They were getting low, right? And these 5 foolish virgins noticed this. They noticed, hey, like our lamps are about to go out. And they took that initiative and communicated that to the others, right? And said, hey, before we lose our light completely, we need oil. Like we need to do something about this, right? And they spoke up. They spoke up, and they spoke up before it was too late, right? Before the problem the problem was kind of starting, right? But they noticed it and they spoke up and they asked for help. And I think that also shows a certain wisdom, right? A wisdom that we don't always have, right? And again, I'll discuss that a little bit more in detail a little bit later, but they noticed that their oil was getting low and was about to run out, and they acted and spoke up before it did. And I think that is another significant way that they showed that they were wise. Number 4, for how the foolish virgins were wise, is that they followed the advice of the wise and they took action by going to the vendor to buy their oil. So they didn't whine and complain about the other virgin's choice, right? Their decision not to share their oil. They didn't just sit there and murmur and complain. And they didn't try to convince the other 5 to change their minds, right? They didn't gaslight them. They didn't like get angry or retaliate or anything like this. And they also didn't like sulk off and walk away like muttering resentments under their breath, like that wasn't their reaction. Instead, they humbled themselves, they acted, they took on that personal responsibility, and they put in the work to go out, seek out the vendor, and get more oil. And I think we can learn a lot from that, right? How often do we approach similar situations with that same attitude? Maybe less often than we would usually like to, right? And so I think this shows, again, considerable wisdom and maturity from those not so wise virgins, let's say. And then number 5, for the ways that the foolish virgins were wise, is that they came back and they knocked. So they came back first of all, they didn't just go off and say, okay, well, we've missed it, we don't have enough oil, the bridegroom's probably come already. I mean, they announced it while our lamps were going out. We probably don't have enough time to get back in time. they didn't just like give up and say, well, I guess we missed it, like that sucks, you know, and like go on with their lives. They came back. They came back to that building or that place, you know, where the feast was being held. So the King James Version of the Bible says that when the virgins went back, the five who had gone to get more oil, when they went back to where the bridegroom was, they found the door was shut. But if we look at the translation and the Greek word, it actually means more specifically that it was locked. And so not only was the door shut, but it was locked. And so I kind of envision, you know, the virgins, like, not only did they just, like, they went back, right? They went back to the building where the feast was being held. I imagine them checking the door, right? Like, to know that it was locked, right? They would have had to try to open it. So they tried to open the door themselves, discovered it was locked. And they didn't stop there either. After discovering that it was locked, they knocked. They knocked on the door, right? And so in all of these ways, I see the virgins be like the five foolish virgins being wise and proactive, right? They came back, they tried to enter the door, they found out that it was locked, right? And they knocked. And so they didn't give up. They didn't give up trying to enter, right? And we can speculate as to like what that tenacity really means, right? Is that an insistence on their entitlement, or is that actual like faithful striving, right? We don't know exactly, right? And so I'm not going to say that it was one way or another. I recognize that the same decisions, the same behaviors, the same actions can have different reasons, different motivations. I understand that, right? But I still think it's amiable that they took those steps, and I think they deserve to be recognized. So they didn't give up trying, right? They didn't give up trying to access the feast and to be there. And I think that's worth recognizing and acknowledging. Yeah. So 5 ways that I think the foolish virgins were actually wise.